I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. John Parmentola, an adjunct staff member at the RAND Corporation, where he works on defense, energy, science, and technology strategy and planning. His career also includes experience as a senior vice president at General Atomics, the director for research and laboratory management for the U.S. Army, chief scientist at the U.S. Department of Energy, and chief of advanced systems and operations at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. John is an honorary member of the U.S. Army S&Ts, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a recipient of the Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Executives, as well as being the U.S. Army's 10 Greatest Inventions Award winner of the Alfred Raymond Prize, the Sigma XI Research Award, and the winner of many other awards and honors. John has a PhD in physics from MIT and has served on the faculty of MIT, West Virginia University, and as a fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He joins us today to talk about the Cold War, SDI, and defense strategy issues. So John, welcome. Well, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. The Cold War is something for me that's intensely interesting. I was born in '76, and so I grew up right at the very end of it, right? I have those childhood memories of the Cold War and kind of the anxiety and the social issues that existed. But certainly I don't have the exposure or knowledge or depth of anyone like yourself. So I can't thank you enough for joining me. So if it's okay, let me start out with the early days of the Cold War, right? Because this is something in many ways that predates yourself, me, all of us, right? So what do you remember about those early days? And when did you first get involved with it, I guess, in a professional capacity?
Thank you very much, Tim, for inviting me to this interview. I really appreciate it. To go about answering your question, I was born in 1948. I grew up during a time just after World War II, where when you went to public school, there were drills. So the standard drill, as I recall, every week was to hide under your desk with your hands over your head, because that's what we were told to do, in a crouched position, because there could be an attack by the Soviet Union. And so, we grew up with this idea that nuclear war was something that could happen, and we needed to take protective measures. Of course, being young kids, we didn't realize that what we were doing was absolutely futile in terms of trying to deal with something like this. The other thing that influenced, at least me, in terms of my own experience, was an awareness of the US space program. And that was launched during the Eisenhower administration. But kids became very aware of missiles, rockets. And I had a strong interest myself in building model airplanes and flying them, as well as firing off rockets. I even designed a rocket myself. If I went into how I designed it, it's a journey and a mystery of how I pieced together different pieces of material to make one, and it actually worked. I got a little help from the hobby shop up on White Plains Road in terms of getting fuel, but I even mixed the fuel with firecracker powder to try and improve its performance. So this was all a part of what was happening. And then, of course, there was Sputnik, which was something that caught the United States completely unaware. And we as kids became aware of space and space travel, the possibility of space travel. And so these events influenced our thinking. at the time, I didn't really realize how much of an influence the Cold War and also our transition out of World War II was influenced by it. And looking back, a lot of the emphasis on science and technology in the school system was driven by investments that the United States government was making in research and exploring the unknown. And so that trickled down into the school system where, you know, as grammar school kids, we learned about atoms, you know, and the importance of atoms. I remember as a kid making up a science fair poster of an atom, and I sketched it and everything. And it wound up being given a high priority on a billboard in the school I was going to. It was PS Public School 103. Was, you know, so then of course as we progressed, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really was very visible. And then after that, or around that, probably even before, the government was thinking about deploying anti-ballistic missile systems. The Army was heavily involved in it, and there was talk of deploying anti-ballistic missile systems around cities, you know, numerous cities across the United States to protect everyone. And then that got degraded into just protecting missile silos, you know, ICBM silos, you know. So I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis, the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems, and the need for negotiations with the Russians to try to control the numbers made the threat very real to the American public. And that influenced a lot of the thinking at the time as to how do we deal with this onerous, horrendous system that could destroy an entire country or countries in the process. So the way I got involved in this was, first of all, I decided to become a physics major. And once you become a physics major, the legacy of the Manhattan Project becomes a part of your life. Because largely it was physicists who led the development of the first atomic bomb, and then later to thermonuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb. So this is a part of the legacy. Of course, when physicists did that and the war was ended, they became heroes. They were national heroes. Science was so important. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt made it very important because I think he saw the need for the country to invest in science and technology. That's the reason why he asked Vannevar Bush to come up with a plan for the nation, which influenced the whole science and technology enterprise after World War II. You know. But my involvement was through physics. And then when I went to MIT as a graduate student, a lot of the physicists there, not a lot, quite a few of them participated in the Manhattan Project. So they were very active in trying to advise the nation in regard to the issues associated with nuclear weapons. And I got involved in it in a somewhat of an indirect way. I graduated and then I was asked to stay on. And one of my mentors, his name was Herman Feshbach, he was a legend in nuclear physics and mathematical methods of physics. And he inspired me to get involved in international human rights issues. There were scientists in various countries that were being persecuted because they opposed policies of governments in regard to science and technology issues of the time. Through that, I got involved in a number of countries, Philippines, Argentina, Romania, and of course, the former Soviet Union. And so the Cold War was a part of that because there were people that were seeking certain freedoms that, especially in the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was denying them, you know. And so I got involved, seriously involved in that effort, went to the Soviet Union to an unofficial seminar that I participated in and tried to help these people gain their freedom. At the same time, there was a new program created at MIT called the Program on Science and Technology for International Security. And the person that led that was Professor Bernard T. Feld. And Bernie was involved in the Manhattan Project in the early days. In fact, pre-Manhattan Project. He was one of the first individuals to do chain reaction calculations at Columbia University, because he worked for Leo Szilard, who, you know, claimed that he was the first to conceive of an atomic weapon. And so I was mentored by Bernie, and I know a lot about the history of that era and how they approached the development of the atomic bomb. But at the time, Bernie was concerned about a couple of issues. One was deploying intercontinental ballistic missiles on mobile ones, and whether these should be on the road or on a rail system, and should they be in shelters, and should they move around from shelter to try and increase their survivability. Okay, so there was that study that Bernie proposed to be an important study for the group that he started. And then there was another one on particle beam weapons. And this was pre-SDI. This was around 1978, I think it was. And Bernie wanted me to be the sort of junior person on a study where senior members would discuss the physics and operational issues associated with particle beam weapons. And so I was there taking the notes, you know, of senior members. And then I was given the job to assemble it all in terms of actual report. So at that time, the senior person who led this study was Richard Garwin. He's a fellow of an IBM fellow. He worked at IBM. And Dick was one of the persons instrumental in developing the first thermonuclear weapon. That was Mike, it's called Mike. And so Dick got up at the blackboard. We had blackboards in those days. And he worked through some simple calculations to evaluate the potential performance of particle beam weapons. And then I spent 3 months developing models of their use in various environments, outer space, in the atmosphere. And so we eventually published an authoritative paper in Nature magazine, which the conclusions of which still has withstood the tests of time.
Yeah.
So, so that's the way I got involved in this. That's basically the way I got involved. And then everything else afterwards followed me everywhere I went. So, and so I kept an interest in the subject.
Well, and I want to come back to that paper, and you'd sent me that one before the interview, and that was the Nature article. I think it was published in 1979 eventually, but yeah, let me rewind a little bit back to the 50s. And again, this is just one of the things that's intrigued me is the psychology of it, right? Growing up in this era. And I think that's something that, I mean, there are always these existential threats or what people claim to be existential threats. But at that time, this threat of nuclear holocaust was something that was pervasive, and I mean, back in the 50s, we had nuclear bombers in the air at all times. People were building fallout shelters in their backyards. Now, as the technology progressed, and I guess you probably saw this moving forward. I think everyone probably did, but you probably saw this, you probably paid more attention than most. It went from bombs, right? And to, I mean, the H bomb, and then MIRVs, and eventually ICBMs and mutually assured destruction. Did you notice this? I mean, again, at the time, did you see this increase in capability? I guess, was this something that
I would say only indirectly in terms of the things I mentioned. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, was a real turning point because people could see that these systems could be deployed right 90 miles away from the United States and hold the whole country at risk. And what's more, it was almost putting the United States and the former Soviet Union on the brink of an actual nuclear war. There was very serious concern at the time that everything could just fall apart and nuclear weapons would actually be used. So those are the kind of events. I think the issue of the bombers being in the air and all the operational things, they were sort of in the background and hidden to a large degree. They weren't really made all that public. The average person didn't know that nuclear weapons were actually being transported on the US road system, for servicing and things like that. I mean, the only way they knew about it is if one of these transporters went through a small town, and stopped everything in the small town so that it could pass through, but most of America was, in my view, was too busy with life itself. But when something like the confrontation that occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think that raised serious flags. And then the idea of deploying an anti-ballistic missile system to protect the American people from an attack, that only heightened the whole issue of the incredible nature of this threat to life in the United States, and so, in fact, I lived in a part of Virginia where nearby there was a Nike site, the remnants of a Nike site that was actually deployed outside of Washington, D.C. Of course, it was terminated, because people began to fear it because they learned that this system had to be nuclear in order for it to be able to destroy incoming Russian reentry vehicles, weapons that are on a ballistic path to destroy cities. So we needed nuclear interceptors in our backyard in order to protect people. And there was a lot of consternation about this. You know, analyses done, protests by people that they didn't want something like this in and around a major city. So then Nixon, I think, President Nixon tried to diffuse it by changing the strategy. In other words, instead of protecting cities, we're going to protect our missiles, our ICBMs, for example, against first strike. You know, but even that led to a lot of controversy because the simple-minded argument that people made was, well, it's going to cost you X to deploy this system, and then what is it going to cost the Russians to increase the number of weapons to overwhelm the system that you deployed?
Yeah, and that's the mad strategy. That's
and then people said, well, it doesn't make any sense because it's cheaper for them to deploy a MIRV system than it is for us to deploy a defense system to take them out. You know, and so I remember, I think it was McNamara and his whiz kids did all kinds of analyses of this and tried to discourage. You know, but the problem is, you know, if you can build something and you can make up a story about, well, this is going to save lives, and it involves large amounts of money, their interest behind that money, that catch the attention of Congress because it creates jobs, you know, in their districts, and they can couch it in a moral argument about, you know, we're trying to save people's lives by doing this. But, you know, when people analyzed it, they said, it's not going to work. It's not in your interest. So the interest shifted more to treaties to try to limit the number of these things, and also verification methods to try and verify that both sides are not cheating. And there was another treaty, the ABM treaty, that was put in place to ban anti-ballistic missile systems because it was believed that they would only escalate the number of nuclear weapons that would be deployed. Of course, the treaty didn't help in that because there were constant problems with accusations that the Russians are cheating, you know, and the Russians made us more sensitive to their aggression by invading Czechoslovakia, for example. And then around the time of Jimmy Carter, invading Afghanistan. And the troubles that we were having with monitoring limits on the number of weapons that they were deploying. These things created a political opportunity to revisit the whole defense aspect. And, you know, national labs, they were working on technologies. And I can tell you from working in the Department of Energy, when a national lab works on technology and they demonstrate some level of usage, then they have a hammer and every problem that comes up is a nail. You know, so, okay, we got a defense problem. Oh, we got the answer, you know, and so, you know, they have an interest in it. Why? Because it'll feed their ability to be able to develop these technologies, which, you know, that's their interest. They enjoy technology, right? You know, and so, you know, and industry's happy because they'll come in and help develop the systems and so on and so forth. You know, but then the real question is, does it make sense to can you convince yourself that this could lead to an outcome that's better, less dangerous than the one we're in? And that involves analysis and human judgment, and so the debate continues, So.
Well, so yeah, I want to jump. Actually, I'm going to skip a few questions. I want to jump to SDI because you mentioned particle beams.
Yeah.
On March 23rd, 1983, Ronald Reagan announced this. From what I've read, he basically just kind of pulled this out of his hat. I believe Edward Teller had said he wasn't even sure where Reagan got the idea, but Reagan's idea was we can get out of mutually assured destruction. We can get out of what he described as a suicide pact by this wide range of anti-ballistic missile ideas. Everything from lasers. They looked at CO2 lasers mounted on 747s. I remember reading about that. Particle beam weapons, as you studied. Ground and space-based missiles, and they even had a space-based kinetic weapon called the Rods of God. I read about that one in Popular Science. Now, you've been critical of a lot of these ideas.
Yeah.
So could you tell me a little bit about SDI? I mean, is there any shot that this thing would have worked?
Well, first of all, I don't believe what Teller said. Okay. In other words, Livermore Labs, Teller, and Lowell Wood were chief proponents for the technologies that they were developing along with other national labs. And I guarantee you that Teller had conversations with Reagan, about this, that there was an opportunity to protect the nation. And then, of course, you get a politician who doesn't understand this stuff, but knows how to use words to convince people that, well, we can build a shield, build a shield around the United States. So people understand the idea of a shield, the concept of a shield, right? It's sort of like being on the Starship Enterprise and putting up the shields. I need more power, to defend the Starship Enterprise, against an attack. So, all of this was very science fiction inspiring, let's say, right? But the main issue with any defense system is leakage from a technical standpoint. There's another issue that you have to worry about that people usually don't talk about, but leakage is a big issue. One nuclear weapon detonating on a city will ruin your day, And so there are plenty of tactics that are available to the offense to make sure that nuclear weapons get through. And, these plagued the original ABM system that was originally proposed to protect cities. So you had to do something to cut down on the leakage. And the best way of doing that is to try to intercept a ICBM during its launch from the country that is carrying out the attack. And the only way people came up with to try and do this was, of course, space-based platforms, where you were going to deploy these things in space and try to get at the boosters and disable the ICBM. Because once it completes its trajectory and it deploys the reentry vehicles, it can not only deploy real reentry vehicles, it can deploy decoys that look like a cheap decoys that take up limited volume inside the nose cone of the rocket and deploy them. And they're difficult to distinguish from the actual reentry vehicles. Also, you can do something that's a bit perverse. You make the actual weapon look like a decoy. And so you got two ways to do this, right? So
yeah.
So once this happens, you've got a big problem. And so you try to get at the booster, and boost phase intercept is the real challenge.
Well, and so one of the things that I'd read about these SDI technologies is that they were criticized because they said, if it looks like we can make this work, it may actually provoke a Soviet attack.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And that gets to the other issue that I wanted to talk about. And that is, in order to do something like this, given the destructive power of the weapons we're talking about, you would need an enormous amount of cooperation on both sides, where the technology would have to be shared and a lot of confidence built on both sides. And you would have to convince both sides that you could reduce the number of nuclear weapons that you have while not taking advantage of the defense system that you're deploying. Because all of this is perceptions about whether the other side could preemptively attack you and use the defense system to deal with whatever you're going to throw at it afterwards. And so the book I wrote, along with a couple of other authors, emphasized the cooperation aspects that would have to take place. And we actually went through scenarios where instabilities could occur that actually provoke an attack. And so, but that part of it is not technical to some degree. It has to do with human behavior and then trying to develop trust with your adversary to do something like this in a safe manner.
Well, and what now? So one of the things that you touched on, I should highlight this for the audience. I'd read that Reagan actually mentioned at one point sharing these Star Wars technologies with the Russians. And that may have been a political game, but I'm sure to some degree it was. But I recall reading about him saying, well, no, this isn't just for us. Once we perfect this, we could share it with them. I think that was what you were touching on earlier, right?
Yeah, right. But, I find it hard to imagine, given the deep secrecy that exists within the military establishments in the United States and that of the former Soviet Union, that sharing would be one of their top priorities.
Well, that and then there's the workability in the first place. And again, I've got my list of questions. I'm just going through them here, and I hope that I'm not distracting you too much, because I know that you have a good stream of consciousness. But
ask all the questions you want. I'll try to answer them. But
yeah, well, and I know you, like your study, the study that you did was, and again, this was like 1978, 79. You guys were looking at particle beams saying, look, this won't work. Now, in 1987, the American Physical Society looked at the whole wide range of technologies. And this is over, this is like a decade later. And they said, these are decades away from being ready to use. We're not even sure. It'll take us 10 years to figure out if these technologies are even possible. So, I guess that helped shift things towards this idea of the brilliant Pebbles concept, right? Which was just small orbiting missiles. This is the boost phase thing? Or?
Before bringing Pebbles, there was smart rocks. But a rock conveys the idea, well, that's a lot bigger than a pebble. So here we go with the Madison Avenue marketing to try and figure out if we could go from a shield now to a smart rock that really is intelligent. We can find and hone and kill your adversary's offensive capability. But a rock, well, it's kind of big. So let's go to a pebble. Well, that's really small. And small means it's cheap, right? It's sort of like, the price of a transistor or something.
Well, and if we're putting them in space too, you don't want to put rocks in space. You put pebbles in space because
pebbles, right?
Yeah.
Right. But it's all designed to try and give the impression, well, this is doable, affordable, right? And then if you look at the history of brilliant Pebbles, you find out that, you know, it goes from 10 billion to 50 billion in just, you know, a few years, you know, so, you know, and still, how would you go about really convincing yourself that this system would work? Which gets to another issue, right? It, in a sense, doesn't matter if it works. Question is, what is the perception of it? Does it convey the perception that this is an impenetrable shield that can protect the United States or not? Because nobody's going to test this. It's ludicrous. You're going to test it. You know, they'll test it. They'll test it in circumstances that are favorable to those that have an interest in it. Not, you know, objectively test it in scenarios where it fails. Why would they do that, right? You know, so it's all a contrived psychological game couched in technology to try to convince people, the taxpayer, to spend money on something, right? My view of all of this is 500 nuclear weapons on both sides would be more than enough to destroy enough real estate in both countries that you don't need any more of them. And the longer a nuclear weapon is not used, the less credible it becomes as an instrument of warfare. It's more of a political statement about a nation being a superpower or achieving some technological prowess with regard to mastering the development of a nuclear weapon or an atomic bomb. You know, it's more about prowess.
Yeah.
It really is about using something. Now, if you start thinking about small nuclear weapons, low yield nuclear weapons, then I think you're creating a situation where you're encouraging the acquisition of more of them, because then you're trying to believe that these things are usable, okay? That you could use them with limited yield to do damage. You know, and my view of nuclear weapons, they're like Lay's potato chips. You just can't eat one. Once you start using them, you're going to use them. And you open up the whole bag of worms of escalation into a full nuclear war. You know, and so I remember I was once interviewed for a position, political appointment at DOE by the Bush administration. And they asked me, well, what is your opinion about small nuclear weapons? And I said, these would encourage their use. It would encourage an increase in the numbers of them on both sides and would make the world actually more dangerous than it is now. And so I didn't get the job.
Yeah, no,
So,
I completely understand what you're saying. Yeah,
they're destabilizing. They're destabilizing. They don't lead to stability. What you want people to realize that these weapons are so destructive that we need less of them, not more of them. And what's more, our ability to be able to deliver these things with greater precision based upon advancements in rocket technology is improved. That means the old rules for using these things against a target, because you know the military is not satisfied with using one nuclear weapon against a military target. You have to use multiple because you cannot precisely target. And there may be errors, right? But those errors have been reduced, which means they should be thinking about reducing the number of nuclear weapons that you need to go after a hardened target, right? You know, so there are technological developments that should encourage people that we don't need as many of these things as we had before. They're sort of like the weapon of last resort, you know, that, you know, if if the country can't be saved in a war, these are the weapons of last resort, to prevent the country from being dissolved or taken over.
Well, John, I'd like to touch on something called SDI2. And you mentioned marketing. You mentioned marketing with Brilliant Pebbles. This is absolutely a marketing term, but and this one kind of snuck in there, I guess. But back in 2019, the government resumed space-based interceptor development for the first time in 25 years. And that happened when President Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's, I guess, currently underway. It's part of a new national space defense architecture that was the division of Michael Griffin, as well as, and CIA Director Mike Pompeo called for additional funding to achieve what he described as a strategic defense initiative for our time, SDI2. Have you heard anything about this program?
Not much. Not much. I haven't run across much about it, and until they define what the system is and how it's going to operate, how they're going to go about deploying the platforms, the number of platforms, because one of the problems, which I didn't discuss before, is when you deploy these things in orbit, you have to have a certain number of them over the region of the Soviet Union, region of Russia now, that has ICBMs. So at any given time, you have to have a certain number of these platforms that are concentrated there. So you have to have multiple orbital trajectories that interlace or come together at any given time there. Now, the number you need is a function of altitude or range of the interceptor. If you have a long range interceptor, you don't need as many, okay? But as you get to lower altitude, you need more and more of these in order to be able to cover the area. That is a function of the range of the weapon. So if you have a short range weapon, you need many low Earth orbits in order to be able to have enough of these concentrated. If you have a very long range interceptor, the number of orbits you need and the number per orbit go down, which affects the cost, obviously. The same is true for particle beams. The same is true for lasers. Doesn't matter. It's a property of the range of the weapon that you're trying to exploit. I wrote a paper about this in Aeronautics and Astronautics Journal on how to size constellations of these platforms. And the costs go up enormously depending upon the range. So until they go about defining all of this, how they plan to deploy it and so on, what the effectiveness of it would be and how would they go about proving its effectiveness and so on, if they think somehow Russia's going to sit by and allow them to do something like this, or China for that matter, I don't buy it. And if anything, our relationship with China has likely gotten a lot worse. And there are rumors that the Chinese are pushing forward with deploying more ICBMs. But those are sort of rumors, and one doesn't.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's changed, and I'm not sure what to think of this, but you mentioned small nuclear devices a few moments ago. It's not monolithic anymore. It's not just the United States and the Soviet Union. Now it's the US, Russia, North Korea has something. Iran is trying, it looks like, to get something. China has their own inventory, and they had that during the final part of the Cold War as well, So you've got, rogue nations getting involved, pursuing these. And so as you mentioned, it's destabilizing, right? And then there are these questions about, for me, there are questions about, I've heard there's the possibility of putting nuclear weapons in cargo containers for commercial shipping, and that's something that SDI wouldn't target at all. But
Yeah.
but there is this idea of, back in the day, if a launch happened, you could be reasonably assured that it would be, Russian terror, Soviet territory, right? They had a reasonable assurance it's going to go here or there, and that's what made Cuba so scary.
Yeah.
But these days, I guess I wonder, there's this unpredictability to it, right? Like where, why, how, will something just launch? Do you think that might be some of the inspiration for this SDI-2 idea?
Yeah, but I don't know how they would protect against those things. The DOE has spent an enormous amount of money trying to develop technologies for cargo scans that are rapid, and will not take a lot of time and so on. But once these things get into the portal, who knows, right? They could be remotely detonated and destroy a whole port. I think what we need more of is intelligence and human to try to understand who the potential perpetrators are and how might they go about doing this and when they do it. That's probably our best hope. And by the way, you can cause an enormous amount of havoc in the world without detonating a device on territory. So I did a study when I was at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency that went through scenarios where a country might, like North Korea, launch a low yield, low altitude nuclear device that over time could destroy low Earth orbit satellites. And the way it does it is through increasing the electron content of the Earth's magnetic field lines, because the electrons move sort of like in spiral orbits that bounce between the poles. This is normal, but you can increase the number of those electrons, and electrons can penetrate the electronics and cause damage. And over time, they can destroy the satellites, and they can destroy an enormous number of them. So, I mean, some people think it's a very unrealistic scenario, but it doesn't kill anybody. It's not an attack on a homeland or anything. It's just an attack on a bunch of satellites, and
Yeah.
And what does North Korea have to lose in that? Not much. The world has more to lose, So, there are things that countries can do, we looked a lot at this stuff when I went to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. We were given wide latitude in looking at weapons of mass destruction and also high explosives, because high explosives have been shown to cause an enormous amount of damage, like Cobart Towers, or the federal building.
Well, and they lack, conventional munitions lack the finality, I guess.
Yeah.
Right? That nuclear weapons do. So,
but they can cause huge amounts of damage and loss of life.
Yeah.
And so we took a look at that to see if there were technical means to detect them, and so and then while I was at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, I was asked by Ambassador James Goodby, who was at the time working for General Shalikashvili, who was the assistant to the president on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And Jim asked me to do a couple of studies for him, try to inform Shally of the state of technology to monitor the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And so I completed those studies. And of course, Shally recommended that the president go forward with trying to encourage the signing of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Because that would, if countries signed up to it, it's a statement about the acceptance of nuclear weapons as what you would call an existential threat. You know, accepting it as a threat to humanity, saying basically these weapons are not legitimate weapons that should be used under any circumstances, you know. And so I personally thought through this, and I think, you know, countries signing that and taking it seriously is a major step forward, making the world a safer place, you know, for all of us, you know. But fortunately, the United States hasn't done any testing. You know, there's a moratorium, you know, so in that sense, it's playing a leadership role, you know, that, you know, which I think is a good thing, but it would be better if the countries signed it, you know, and agreed, no more testing.
Well, John, on that note, let me end for today. Let me thank you so much for your time and for sharing these experiences and thoughts and opinions with us.
I'm happy to do it. And, you know, I hope people maintain their awareness of the nuclear issue, because it's so serious a problem. Things can happen by accident, and an accident with a nuclear weapon is not a minor thing by any stretch of the imagination. And we need to always maintain a consciousness of the importance of trying to control these devastating weapons, you know. So anyway, but thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again.
Yep, take care. Bye-bye now.